Hello everyone, welcome back. Dr. Chip Abrahamson here. I'd like to start by thanking those of you who decided to take the plunge and follow, and especially my supporters for encouraging me to continue this. Today I'll be talking about sourcing. Where do you get your food from? Do you know? You know where it comes from? Not just it comes from the grocery store or it comes from McDonald's, but actually, can you trace the food that you eat all the way back to where it came from? Well, today I'm going to help you understand where your food comes from. I put this talk into two parts based on how Michael Pollan, an author, divides it into industrial food and traditional, or what I call real food. Today we're going to do industrial food. I look at food as, and sourcing as, the ugly, the bad, and the good. And today we're going to do the ugly and the bad. Sourcing is the term that's used by foodies to find out, where does my food come from? How do I do that? Where do I look? How do you start? And I hope I can answer some of those questions today, especially with my story. I'll be looking at some notes during this, and I'll be reading excerpts from an excellent book that got me started early on, way back when, well, okay, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And I hope at the end of this talk you'll understand better where industrial food comes from. Fast food and food at Whole Foods, organic market. At age 18, I was in the dentist office and he found 18 cavities. 1972. It took 4 trips back to the dentist to fill all those cavities with mercury amalgam, which is what they used back then. What's interesting is 6 months prior to that, I had all my cavities filled. So those 18 cavities occurred in just 6 months. I was at college. I was feeding myself. I didn't know where my food was coming from, what was good for me, and I was starting to suffer because of it. But I did not make the connection. I didn't know it had anything to do with food. I thought I just had soft teeth and that it was genetic. 15 years later, I had a skin cancer removed, my first and only skin cancer removed from my face. I was told by the plastic surgeon, wear a big hat, don't get any sun on your body, and put on sunscreen. Then, a few years later, I put our bed on bricks and tilted it with the head up so I could sleep at night because I had such severe reflux. I had acid reflux from my stomach. I was amazed the day that my sister-in-law gave me a Zantac pill when we went out to a restaurant so that I could eat spaghetti with red sauce. I couldn't eat spaghetti sauce. It gave me too much heartburn. And I took one Zantac and I thought it was a miracle pill. But then everything fell apart when I was sitting in a dentist office about 12 years ago, around age 55. And the dentist said to me, you need 2 root canals. And I looked at him and said, I don't get it. I've had pain for 2 years. You've tried all this other stuff. The x-rays are normal. And you want to drill out my blood vessel and my nerve in my tooth. and put cement in there? I said, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. If I did that to your knee, I would get sued, and I should get sued, and I probably would lose my license. I ripped the paper cloth off my neck, and I said, I'm going to get a second opinion. Then I found a book. I Googled, and I found a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price. And I solved the pain with cod liver oil from greenpasture.org. I woke up at that time. Something is going on. My dentist doesn't know that I was vitamin D deficient and had a stress fracture in the dentin, the bone supporting my teeth. My dentist didn't know about vitamin D and cod liver oil. And I'm a doctor, and I should know that stuff too. Why aren't they teaching this in medical school and dental school? That year I read 43 books on nutrition, written by MDs, PhDs, good science, many chapters with 30 references. And I was used to reading journal articles, so I understood that well. And I wondered, why isn't this information about nutrition being taught to people like me in medical school or to my dentist? That got me started on improving nutrition in my life, but I didn't know where to get it. I didn't know where to go. I just decided one day in a grocery store that I wasn't going to buy anything that wasn't nutritious or good for me anymore. So I looked at all the items I usually bought, and I didn't leave the grocery store with even one of them, realizing after 2 hours of searching that there was nothing that didn't have some harmful substance, or that wasn't old, or just didn't have any nutrition. After a day or two, I was very hungry. And I thought, now what am I going to do? I got myself in another pickle. But I Googled again. I found a website called eatwild.com, and that started my search for real food, for nutrient-dense food, for food that would keep me healthy, so I wouldn't have to go to a dentist and get 18 cavities filled, so that I could avoid the reflux, the acid reflux, the heartburn, so that I wouldn't get a skin cancer again, so that I wouldn't have to use the sunscreen that was taken off the market because it was proven to be carcinogenic, and not have any root canals. And my search has gone for 12 years, and I'm there. I've landed there. I know where to get my food. I have several sources. Eventually, during this 2-part series, I'll share that with you. I'll leave some links on how I get nutritious, nutrient-dense food, real food, unprocessed or minimally processed. But for now, I'll show you the first book that I came across when I decided to look at sourcing. Very interestingly, my sister-in-law showed me this book. I think she even gave me the first copy I had, which I gave away, but I bought another copy, which is the 10th edition, which I'll show you. It was years ago, but it's a great book. I want to share it with you. I'm going to read excerpts from it, and we're going to go through 4 meals that Michael Pollan, the author, ate in his investigation for where does food come from. This is the book. Let me switch over here. This is the book, Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of 4 Meals by Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan is an LA Times reporter, or at least he was last time I checked. He is an excellent author. That's why I've chosen to read some excerpts from the book this time, because I can't sum it up with such great language as he can. He also did what I did. He decided to do it for himself rather than follow anybody else. He decided to go to the source. He decided to eat the foods from all four sources: fast food, organic grocery store, Whole Foods, a farm, and then lastly, hunting and gathering. Those are the four meals. Today we're going to do the first two, and in part two we'll get to the second two. But today, the ugly and the bad. And with that, I do want to show a couple slides first, and show you something that interested me recently when I made my Christmas dinner. And let's go back to that. This is the slide that or picture that I used as the teaser. And we are going to do the guacamole. That's part two. But today, as another teaser, I wanted to show what I cooked for Christmas and see if you can guess what this is. I'll give you a hint. It's about 18 inches wide and it has a long bone sticking out of one end. Okay. Enough of that. Let's go back and read from Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan, Omnivore's Dilemma. Introduction. What should we have for dinner? This book is a long and fairly involved answer to this seemingly simple question. Along the way, it also tries to figure out how such a simple question could ever have gotten so complicated. As a culture, we seem to have arrived at a place where whatever native wisdom we may once have possessed about eating has been replaced by confusion and anxiety. Somehow this most elemental of activities, figuring out what to eat, has come to require a remarkable amount of expert help. How did we ever get to the point where we need investigative journalists to tell us where our food comes from and nutritionists to determine the dinner menu? Well, he explains in the introduction that in 1971, when I was 17, we were told by the government that fats were bad for us. And so everybody started eating a low-fat diet, including how we fed our children. We thought the government knew what they were doing, that they had our best interests in mind. In 1977, he says in the book, a Senate committee had issued a set of dietary goals, warning beef-loving Americans to lay off the red meat. And so we dutifully had done. What set off the sea of change? It appears to be a perfect media storm of diet books, scientific studies, and one timely magazine article. In the summer of 2002, the New York Times magazine published a cover story on the new research titled, "What if fat doesn't make you fat?" Within months, supermarket shelves were restocked and restaurant menus rewritten to reflect the new nutritional wisdom. The blamelessness of steak restored two of the most wholesome and uncontroversial foods known to man. Bread and pasta acquired a moral stain that promptly bankrupted dozens of bakeries and noodle firms and ruined an untold number of perfectly good meals. So violent a change in a culture's eating habits is surely a sign of a national eating disorder. Certainly it wouldn't have happened in a culture in possession of deeply rooted traditions surrounding food and eating. Yet, as he says, we went on as a culture to eat a fifth of our meals in cars, or feed fully a third of our children's meals from fast food restaurants. And he says, nor would such a culture as ours be shocked to discover that there are other countries, such as Italy and France, that decide their dinner questions on the basis of such quaint and unscientific criteria as pleasure and tradition. Countries like France and Italy. We show our surprise at this by speaking of the French paradox. How could people eat such demonstrably toxic substances as foie gras and triple cream cheese actually be slimmer and healthier than we are? Yet, Michael Pollan says, I wonder if it doesn't make more sense to speak in terms of an American paradox. That is, a notably unhealthy people obsessed by the idea of eating healthily. The United States, this is not from his book, the United States, when I started doing my food sourcing, was ranked about number 31 in longevity, how long we live. And now we are a dismal 48th. And from one source I saw 61st in developing countries. How long we live in the United States, which is a marker of how healthy we are, is horrible. We spend 19% of our GNP on healthcare, on the healthcare industry, for the pills and the surgeries and on from poor health. And yet we spend about 7 or 8% of our GNP on food. Other countries, for example, Italy, spend about 23% of their GNP on food and end up spending only 6 or 7% on healthcare. There is a big difference from our country to another country. Michael Pollan has started his introduction that way, and he calls it the American paradox because we're obsessed with being healthier, and yet we're getting sicker and sicker. I believe because we're ignoring the food that we eat. And I hope to, as we go on, make you more aware of what you're eating. What you do with it's up to you. I'll explain what I do as a result of my research. But we're all free to go down our own path and live our own life. So I'm certainly not prescribing or telling anybody how to eat. I just want you to know that there are 4 different places, 4 different ways to get your food. And at the end of these 2 parts, I hope that's understandable to you. He explains the question, what to have to dinner, assails every person, and that's what the omnivore's dilemma is. We're omnivores, we can eat meat or vegetables, and how do you decide what to eat for dinner? And that's where we're going with this book. Okay, so that's the introduction. Next, we're going to do the ugly, which is section 1, industrial food, which is the fast food, and then second, the organic grocery store, both food industry, and learn about those two. I want you to know, before we get started on industrial that industrial food was planned. It was not something that people wanted. It's not something anybody voted for. It's not something anybody spent their dollars on. Industrial food for fast food restaurants and for grocery stores began in big part because the government subsidized the food industry by subsidizing corn and soybeans, telling farmers if they didn't grow food that they used to, say sweet potatoes or other foods that they used to grow for people, that the government would pay them not to grow those things. This started early on in the 20th century, but really came to a head with Earl Butz as Secretary of the Department of Agriculture around, I believe, 1971. And he started through the Department of Agriculture and money, maybe from taxes, maybe from the Federal Reserve, but they spent a lot of money to subsidize corn. The small farmers who were growing multiple different products, healthy for our population, keeping the soil healthy, came to Earl Butz and complained and said, how can we compete? You're subsidizing corn and soybeans, but you're not doing anything about pricing. And so the prices now have dropped so low that we can't make a living because of the federal subsidies. And Earl Butz's response was, as Secretary of Agriculture, get big or die, to the farmers. And so within a short time, small farms started to disappear in our country, and along with them, nutrient-dense food. So let's take a look in Michael Pollan's book at one of these industrial farms and see how that works and how that affects the farmer. And that's Chapter 2, the farm. In Section 1, industrial, on our way to learning how it changed around 1971. Okay, Michael Pollan is driving a tractor. He likes to get into it when he does his books. He has a book called How to Change Your Mind about hallucinogens and how they can help with depression. And he actually took the hallucinogens, which makes him one of my favorite authors. But here he is driving a tractor in Iowa on some of the richest soil in the country, although he describes it as disappearing when a rich soil that's taken hundreds of years to develop is plowed. It destroys the soil. And so the soil is now, at this moment, 15 years ago or so, half the thickness, the topsoil, half the thickness of what it used to be. This is in Greene County, Iowa. He says that 1 out of every 4 Americans lived on a farm when this farmer's grandfather arrived in Iowa. That's not that long ago. We were a rural farming country. That's how our country started. And then the change to industrial agriculture around 1970 was a very different thing and an experiment, which you'll see as I go on here, that has failed. His land, this farmer's land and labor supplied enough food to feed his family and 12 other Americans. Besides, less than a century after, fewer than 2 million Americans still farm. And they grow enough to feed the rest of us. What that means is that Naylor's grandson, raising nothing but corn and soybeans on a fairly typical Iowa farm, is so astoundingly productive that he is in effect feeding some 129 Americans. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. Okay, so industrial agriculture. The whole thing that they sold us about, oh, we have to feed the starving world. And they made everybody think that industrial agriculture was good. But now, instead of a wide variety of foods and being able to feed their own family, now these farmers are feeding, okay, 10 times as many people, but it's all corn and soybeans and processed into what the industry calls food. And how has this farmer fared? Okay, let Michael Pollan tell you. Yet George Naylor is all but going broke, and he's doing better than many of his neighbors. For though his farm might feed 129 people, it can no longer support the 4 who live on it. The Naylor farm survives by the grace of Peggy Naylor's paycheck. She works for a social service agency in Jefferson, and an annual subsidy payment from Washington, D.C. Nor can the Naylor farm literally feed the Naylor family as it did in Grandfather Naylor's day. George's crops are basically inedible. They're commodities that must be processed or fed to livestock before they can feed people. George's farm is basically a food desert. Okay, so industrial agriculture destroyed the small farms, which were producing food for their families and 12 families around them, close by. And now George Naylor has to go to the supermarket, and because he can't afford much, he's going broke. He has to buy the processed food from the industry. So the food industry has succeeded. They're getting rich. And the farmers are dying and getting poorer and forced to eat terrible food, all because of government subsidy of corn and soybeans. The 129 people who depend on George Naylor for their subsistence are all strangers, living at the far end of a food chain, so long, intricate, and obscure that neither producer nor consumer has any reason to know the first thing about the other. Ask any one of those eaters where their steak comes from, and they'll tell you the supermarket. Ask George Naylor whom he's growing all that corn for, and he'll tell you the military-industrial complex. To sum it up, Michael Pollan says that the Iowa cornfield and all the others just like it, millions of acres of subsidized corn and soybeans, is the place that most of our food comes from. Most of the food in the United States comes from processed corn and soybean, whether it's put into processed foods in packages, flavored to make it seem like it's real food, or fed to animals, and a steak is made, or a chicken at the grocery store. They're all being fed corn and soybeans. Okay. That's the farm. Next, the natural next step is the feedlot. which is chapter 4. Okay, so we have all this corn industrially, and then they want to industrialize production of meat. You may have heard recently that Bill Gates is buying up farms, and we're going to eat soy fake meat in the future, and he's all excited about it. These guys just can't get enough money and power, I guess. But it will be at the expense of our health. And I believe strongly that those in power, those with the money, do not eat tofu when they can get a steak. I'm not against anyone that wants to be a vegetarian or eat that. I'm just saying that forcing that down our throats, not giving us the freedom to choose when they have the freedom to choose, is hypocritical. So let's get to the feedlot. I'll glance at my notes here. There's a term that you may hear and you don't have to remember, but I'll mention it. A feedlot officially is called a concentrated animal feeding operation, or a CAFO, C-A-F-O, concentrated animal feeding operation. I have a picture of one which I can show you. Here. Okay, here's a picture of one of the best concentrated animal feeding operations. They have 150,000 head of beef cattle. 150,000. Not 500, which would be a big herd to me. Not 10,000, but 150,000. These cattle are started with their mothers on grass, and then they're finished on corn. And they eat corn 3 times a day, typically. And they're fattened, and within 3 or 4 months, they're taken to harvest. And the change in their body chemistry and in their muscles is dramatic in those 3 to 4 months. And it's making us sick. But we'll get to that later. Just know that a feedlot is where almost all meat comes from in the United States, and this is what it's like. My daughter, Allison Morrow, is a journalist, and when she was at King 5 in Seattle, she did a story on one of these concentrated animal feeding operations. And the story was interesting because it was about a neighbor who was complaining that her well water was making her sick. And she said that she shouldn't have to buy bottled water or get an expensive system because her well water was always clean until one of these concentrated animal feeding operations started in her neighborhood. I don't know how many thousand cows they had, but it was the typical CAFO. There's no grass or soil to absorb the urine and the feces, and they basically would wash that, hose it down, and the cattle stay in the same spot, standing there in their 6 foot by 3 foot pen for those many months while they were being fattened. And then they would just wash the urine and the feces off the concrete around the side. And then there wasn't enough soil to absorb it all because these cattle were so concentrated. So the feces and the urine, the toxic substances in the feces from what the cattle were eating, made their way into the well water and sickened this woman. So that's one of the side effects of these CAFOs. It's not nourishing food. It's destructive to our health. Corn upsets the normal balance 1-to-1 of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. And when you eat a steak from one of these CAFOs, that balance is destroyed to the point where omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio is 60-to-1. And that causes inflammation. And if you don't know, inflammation is what's causing most, if not all, disease. Whether it's heart disease, some people say cancer, certainly things like autoimmune disease, inflammatory diseases like that. So this is the ugly, front and center. And Michael Pollan says in this chapter, the urbanization of America's animal population would never have taken place if not for the advent of cheap, federally subsidized corn. Okay? This could not happen. This destruction of our health, of the food we eat, could not have happened if the federal government had not subsidized the production of corn. The federal government and industry, if anything, are more closely tied than they were back in 1971. We know that. If anybody knows anything about Big Pharma and how they go back and forth to work for Big Pharma and then work in a federal government, I think something like 50% of the USDA's employees have worked for big industry and gone back and forth. This complex arrangement is subsidized by the government. They print money through the Federal Reserve. They borrow it from the Federal Reserve, who doesn't have any money, but they're allowed to just make it out of thin air. And then they use that to pay who they want to pay. And so our federal government recently paid hundreds of billions of dollars to pharmaceutical industry for these so-called vaccines, which weren't vaccines until they changed the definition of a vaccine in Webster's dictionary. So, if anything, this relationship between the federal government and industry, the federal government subsidizing large industry at the expense of small business, if anything, it's more intense now than ever. So let's go next to the mill. The processing plant. Okay, so corn has to be processed, and you can't just eat it. Well, I guess you could cook it, but most of it's GMO. It's not made for human consumption. It's got to be processed so that the animals can eat it. And that's the next chapter on the processing. Michael Pollan says in this chapter, the closest I got to following corn through a mill was at the Center of Crops Utilization Research at Iowa State University. The Center for Crops Utilization Research is charged with developing new uses for America's corn and soybean surplus. Okay, since the federal government heavily subsidizes corn and soybeans, now there's more than anybody can use. Farmers are growing it because they can get the federal subsidy, kind of like getting a welfare check from the government, and so they're growing more corn because that's what they get paid to do. And if they don't grow some other food, they can get subsidized for that too. So to get the federal government money, they all grow corn and soybeans. And now there's so much of it that nobody knows what to do with it all. So the government's answer, oh, we'll get the University of Iowa to tell us to find out more uses for corn and soybean. Amazing. So he talked to a chemist there. Okay, that's part of agriculture now. You got to have a chemist. It's part of making. It's part of making beer, making wine. They're all chemists now in big industry. To make sure it comes out right, to make sure it tastes the same, whether Anheuser-Busch has its brewery in California or has its brewery in Tampa Bay. It's got to taste the same. And the only way to do that with different water source and different environmental conditions is through chemistry, which they successfully can do. So they do this wet milling process, the industrial version of digestion. They separate the corn into its parts. And it takes about 5 gallons of water for every bushel of corn to process it. I don't know if you know this, but although the government says be careful how much water you use and don't waste water, the vast majority of water that is used in our country is used by large industry, especially by industrial farming and processing. He goes on to say that as enzymes replaced acids, refiners were able to produce progressively sweeter sweeteners, high fructose corn syrup, invented in Japan, which replaced cane sugar in almost all the drinks. Things like Coca-Cola, Gatorade, on and on. A bushel of corn yields 33 pounds of fructose. After that, after figuring out high fructose corn syrup, Michael Pollan says in the third age of food processing, which begins with the end of World War II, merely preserving fruits of nature was deemed too modest. The goal was now to improve on nature. The 20th century prestige of technology and convenience combined with advances in marketing to push aside butter to make shelf space for margarine, replace fruit juice with juice drinks, and then entirely juice-free drinks like Tang. Cheese with Cheese Whiz, and whipped cream was replaced with Cool Whip. These are all corn products made by chemists. They're not food. They're made to taste like food, but that's deception. And it's done so that they can make money. And the federal government is in bed with the industry to do just that. We cannot serve money and God. Here's another point. The longer the ingredient label on a food, the more fractions of corn and soybean you will find in that food. Thomas Callan, MD, says if it has ingredients, don't eat it. That's the one extreme. But certainly the more ingredients it has, the more it comes from processed corn and soybeans and not from real food. Okay. The next thing that they figured out to do with all this excess corn that the government was subsidizing was make ethanol for cars. So you think, we want to, get away from big oil, and that's why we need to put ethanol in the cars. No, it's because we had too much corn because the government was subsidizing it, and they figured out, well, if we just use enough energy, we can turn corn into into ethanol and we can put it in cars. That's what they did with the excess corn. They made Cool Whip Cheese Whiz, high fructose corn syrup, and ethanol for cars. Okay, that wraps up the first of the two parts. The second thing I'm going to get into in this talk is the whole foods industry, the whole organic industry, and that also for Michael Pollan. Let's take a break from the book and go to, let's go here. The organic industry was about $10 billion a year back when Michael Pollan wrote this book in 2006. It's blossomed since then. It's got to be $40-50 billion a year. So if it has an organic label, everybody wants it. To me, that's kind of like getting a board certified doctor. You have this board certification, so you trust the doctor's got to be good. But 99% of doctors are board certified. So just because they're board certified, they have that certification, like organic certification, doesn't mean that they're necessarily good. It's not that big a thing anymore with organic. The Tampa Bay Times. Some years ago, I think this was 2016, did a series of stories called Farm to Fable, because the big thing was farm to table. Oh, get your food from a local farm. And the idea was industrial food is not good for us, so let's go back to small farms, but let's not give up our convenience. And let's not give up our restaurants. And so all the restaurants and places like Whole Foods were advertising that they got the food from small farms. Some of which I think a few of the farms and a few of the grocery store chains actually maybe did for a short time. But this was investigated by the Tampa Bay Times around 2016, I believe. And what they found was remarkable. That it wasn't anything what people thought. Little, if any, of the food that was advertised coming from local, and of course, the restaurants were now putting on their menus, we get as much organic and as much of the local food that we can, which was none. And it was all a big myth, a big fable. I live in Tampa Bay area, Florida, and every morning outside the restaurants are big trucks, and they're trucking in cans and cartons of food from the food industry, and that's how restaurants get their food. So it's really a fable, but maybe Whole Foods is better than the non-organic. Well, our local grocery store, Publix, now has lots of quote-unquote organic. But is it really organic? Well, let's read some of Michael Pollan's book and find out more about the Whole Foods industry. I skipped a part. I don't know how I did that with all my paper clips here. But I did want to tell you, before I go into the Whole Foods thing, that Michael Pollan ate a meal based on the corn processing, and he went to his family and he said, "Guess what? We're all going to eat fast food for a week." And his kids cheered, and they went to McDonald's. and his son got chicken nuggets. And he asked his son, "Does it taste like chicken?" And his son was quizzical and said, "Of course not. It tastes like chicken nuggets." And he goes on to describe the ingredients in a chicken nugget. So from Michael Pollan, here they are. Of the 38 ingredients it takes to make a McNugget, I counted 13 that can be derived from corn. The corn-fed chicken itself, modified cornstarch to bind the pulverized chicken meat, mono, tri, and diglycerides, which are emulsifiers keeping the fats and water from separating, dextrose, lecithin, another emulsifier, chicken broth to restore some of the flavor that processing leaches out, yellow corn flour and more modified cornstarch for the batter, cornstarch a filler, vegetable shortening, partially hydrogenated corn oil, and citric acid as a preservative. The couple of other plants take part in the nugget. There's some wheat in the batter, and on any given day the hydrogenated oil could come from soybeans, canola, or cotton rather than corn, depending on the market price and availability. According to the handout, McNuggets also contain several completely synthetic ingredients, quasi-edible substances that ultimately come not from corn or soybean field, but from a petroleum refinery or from a chemical plant. These chemicals are what make modern processed foods possible, by keeping the organic materials in them from going bad or looking strange after months in the freezer or on the road. Listed first are the leavening agents: sodium aluminum phosphate, monocalcium phosphate, sodium acid pyrophosphate, and calcium lactate. These are antioxidants added to keep the various animal and vegetable fats involved in a nugget from turning rancid. Then there are the anti-foaming agents, like dimethyl polysiloxane, added to cooking oil to keep starches from binding to the air molecules so as to produce foam when they're fried. The problem is evidently grave enough to warrant adding a toxic chemical to the food. According to the Handbook of Food Additives, dimethyl polysiloxane is a suspected carcinogen, an established mutagen, tumorigen, and reproductive effector. It's also flammable. But perhaps the most alarming ingredient in a chicken McNugget is tertiary butyl hydroxyquinone, or TBHQ, an antioxidant derived from petroleum that is either sprayed directly on the nugget or the inside of the box it comes from to help preserve freshness. According to the Consumer's Dictionary of Food Additives, TBHQ is a form of butane, lighter fluid, that the FDA allows processors to use sparingly in our food. It can comprise no more than 0.02% of the oil in a nugget, which is probably just as well considering that ingesting a single gram of TBHQ can cause nausea, vomiting, ringing in the ears, delirium, a sense of suffocation and collapse, and ingesting just 5 grams, that's a teaspoon, can kill you. With so many exotic molecules organized into a food of such complexity, you would almost expect a chicken nugget to do something more spectacular than taste okay to a child and fill him up inexpensively. What it has done, of course, is to sell an awful lot of chicken for companies like Tyson, which invented the nugget at McDonald's behest in 1983. The nugget is the reason chicken has supplanted beef as the most popular meat in America. Okay, thanks for letting me back up a little bit and do the first meal. And now we're going to get back to his next chapter, which is, oh, let me get it bigger. Which is Big Organic. Quick sip of homemade kombucha. Okay, take a breather if you want. Put it on pause because I got a little more to go. Michael Pollan says, I enjoy shopping at Whole Foods nearly as much as I enjoy browsing a good bookstore, which, come to think of it, is probably no accident. Shopping at Whole Foods is a literary experience. That's not to take anything away from the food, which is certified organic or humanely raised or free range. But right there, that's the point. It's the evocative prose, as much as anything else, that makes the food really special. Elevating an egg or chicken breast or a bag of arugula from the realm of ordinary protein and carbohydrates into a much headier experience, with complex aesthetic, emotional, and even political dimensions. Take the range-fed sirloin steak I recently eyed in the meat case. According to the brochure on the counter, it was formerly part of a steer that spent its days living in beautiful places, ranging from plant-diverse high mountain meadows to a thick aspen groves and miles of sagebrush-filled flats. Now, a steak like this has got to taste better than the one at Safeway, where the only accompanying information comes in the form of a number, the price I mean, which you can bet will be considerably less. But I'm evidently not the only shopper willing to pay more for a good story. With the growth of organics and mounting concerns about wholesomeness of industrial food, storied food is showing up in supermarkets everywhere these days. But it is Whole Foods that consistently offers the most cutting-edge grocery lit. On a recent visit, I filled my shopping cart with eggs from cage-free vegetarian hens, milk from cows that live free from unnecessary fear and distress, wild salmon caught by Native Americans in Yakutat, Alaska, population 833, and heirloom tomatoes from Cape Farm, $4.99 a pound. One of the early pioneers of the organic movement. The organic broiler I picked up even had a name, Rosie, who turned out to be a sustainably farmed free-range chicken from Petaluma Poultry. In several corners of the store, I was forced to choose between subtly competing stories. For example, some of the organic milk was ultra-pasteurized, an extra processing step that was presented as a boon to the consumer since it extends shelf life. But then another more local dairy boasted about the fact that they had no ultra-pasteurization, implying that their product was fresher, less processed, and therefore more organic. This was the dairy that talked about cows living free from distress, something I was beginning to feel a bit of myself by this point. This particular dairy's label had a lot to say about the bovine lifestyle. Its Holsteins are provided with an appropriate environment, including shelter and a comfortable resting area, sufficient space, proper facilities, and the company of their own kind. All this sounded pretty great, until I read the story of another dairy selling milk completely unprocessed, whose cows graze green pastures all year long. It made me wonder whether the first dairy's idea of an appropriate environment for a cow included, as I had simply presumed, pasture. Of course, the trickiest contradiction Whole Foods attempts to reconcile is the one between industrialization of organic foods of the organic food industry, of which it is a part, and the pastoral ideals on which the industry has been built. The organic movement, as it once was called, has come a remarkably long way in the past 30 years, to the point where it now looks considerably less like a movement than a big business. Lining the walls above the sumptuously stocked produce section in my Whole Foods are full-colored photographs of local organic farms, accompanied by text blocks setting forth their farming philosophies. A handful of these farms, Cape is one example, still sell their produce to Whole Foods, but most are long gone from the produce bins, if not yet the walls. That's because Whole Foods in recent years has adopted the grocery industry's standard regional distribution system, which makes supporting small farms impractical. Tremendous warehouses buy produce for dozens of stores at a time, which forces them to deal exclusively with tremendous farms. So while the posters still depict family farms and their philosophies, the produce on sale below them comes primarily from the two big corporate organic growers in California, Earthbound Farm and Grimway Farms, which owns Cal Organic. Just how well does supermarket pastoral hold up under close reading and scrutiny? About as well as anyone would expect anything genuinely pastoral to hold up in the belly of an $11 billion industry, which is to say, not very much. At least that's what I discovered when I traced a few of my items in my Whole Foods cart back to the farms where they were grown. Okay, that's a really important sentence. This is what sourcing is. If you're going to source your food, you have to trace a few. Okay, it's extremely difficult at first, but so well worthwhile. It takes phone calls, web searches, and visits to farms to really see where your food is coming from. I remember one time I was in a grocery store and I started, well, if I'm going to go to a grocery store, at least I'll get something organic, something that looks healthy. I picked up this salsa and I took it home and ate it. This is great. It tastes good. It's got all organic ingredients and all these listed the ingredients and they're all organic. So this has got to be really good. It tastes good. It's all organic. So I decided, well, I'll call, and I called the company. And I just said to them, wow, your stuff tastes so good. I just want to tell you, what a great product it seems to be. And that's the best way to approach people when you want to get information out of them. Just feed their ego, butter them up. I was being truthful. It really did taste good. So I just said I have a couple questions. And one of the questions was, what about all the germs? And this was a trick question, but I buttered him up enough that he had actually promised to mail me a $25 gift certificate for more salsa because I was so enthralled with his product. And he said, oh, we get rid of the germs. I said, how do you do that? Oh, well, we triple wash. Oh, well, that wasn't on the package. What do you triple wash with? Oh, we use bleach. Oh, wow, you use chlorine bleach. He goes, yeah, 3 times. There are no germs on that salsa that you're eating. I went, no. What about but isn't there chlorine on my salsa? He said, not enough that's going to affect the taste. And, chlorine kills the germs. It's good for you. And that was my last bite of that salsa. Because I thought, no, I don't want to eat my salsa with chlorine on it. So this idea of following your food all the way back to where it comes from, if you haven't done it, is so worth the time. Let's read about how Michael Pollan did it. He traces a few of the items in his cart back to the farms where they came from. For example, some organic milk comes from factory farms where thousands of Holsteins. Okay, Holstein is about productivity, not nutrition. The milk products I get are from A2 cows. I don't have time for that now, but they're A2 and they're high fat, like Jersey cows, and some Swiss cow out in Central Florida that brings their milk here. But Holsteins is nutrient poor dairy. I can tell by the color in, say a Holstein butter compared to a Jersey cow butter. You can tell the difference between corn-fed and the grass-fed just by the color of the butter. Anyway, Holstein cows are for large production. Holstein cow is an industrial cow in this day and age. The reason much of the milk is ultra pasteurized is that big companies can sell it over long distances. Did you know that when milk is pasteurized, that they don't kill all the germs? I was shocked to learn that the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, says that as long as you can get it down to 160,000 germs per cc, okay, that's around 1 million germs in a teaspoon. As long as you get down to around 1 million germs in a teaspoon, then that's fine. That's pasteurized, because very few people get sick from that. But those germs, from a factory farmed cow, it doesn't smell good like a farm. When you go to a feedlot, as Michael Pollan described, and I didn't have time to read, it smells terrible from a mile away. Terrible. You have to hold your nose. And when you go to a farm where the cows are being pastured and they're out in the grass until they're milked, it smells great when you get there. And the reason is the bacteria. Good bacteria smell good and bad bacteria smell bad. So you get 1 million bad bacteria in a teaspoon of milk when it's pasteurized from your grocery store. And you get millions and if not billions of good bacteria from milk that's not pasteurized from a healthy cow from a healthy grass-fed small farm. Okay, so he also traces a microwavable bowl of rice, vegetables, and grilled chicken breast with a savory herb sauce, and finds out that it's a highly industrialized organic product. 31 ingredients assembled from far-flung laboratories and processing plants. And he ends up by saying, so much for Whole Foods. Okay, so Whole Foods is not there to sell whole foods. They're there to make money and nothing more. Not that you couldn't get something good to eat there, or at least better than a McDonald's. He says, I also visited Rosie, the organic chicken that he bought at Whole Foods, at her farm in Petaluma, which turns out to be more an animal factory than a farm. She lives in a shed with 20,000 other Rosies who, aside from their certified organic feed, live lives little different from that of any industrial chicken. But what about the free-range lifestyle promised on the label? True, there's a little door in the shed leading out to a narrow, grassy yard. Okay, remember, that's for 20,000 chickens. A little tiny door with a small, grassy yard. But the free-range story seems a bit stretched when you discover that the door remains firmly shut until the birds are at least 5 or 6 weeks old, which means that they won't go outside when the door's open. Their first 6 weeks has been inside, and they're used to that. And the chickens are slaughtered 2 weeks later. So free range is a term that's made to deceive you. They're not pastured chickens. Pastured chickens are on grass. They might be supplemented with some feed, but they're on grass or they're eating scraps for most of what they eat. They're eating worms and bugs and grass. Okay, let's go forward to his organic industrial meal. Where he eats Rosie, along with asparagus from Mexico, which is a great point. In Farm to Fable, they traced the organic vegetables, in a farmer's market. And what they found was shocking, that they were trucked from Mexico to Arizona. The next day they were trucked to Atlanta. The next day they were trucked to Orlando. And the next day they were trucked to Tampa Bay in Tampa. And the next day trucked to the quote-unquote farmer's market. And Um, I'm going to get in later in the last couple parts about where I get my vegetables. I did today. They were picked yesterday, and wow, they stay fresh for a couple weeks, but I get them every week, and in the refrigerator they stay fresh. But I just can't buy lettuce or greens and most other vegetables from the local organic grocery store because they're brown and they're going bad because they probably are 10 days or more old and they haven't been refrigerated that whole time. Anyway, so vegetables from the local grocery store from Mexico are at least 7 days old and probably 10 days old in my Tampa Bay area. And if you're going to do your sourcing, you should know where things come from, what country, and how long it takes to get there, so you know how old they are. Did you know that about 70% of the nutrition in fruits and vegetables is lost in the first 3 days after they're picked? That's why fresh picked tastes so good compared to something that's old. It's so hard to get someone to eat the vegetables when they're from a grocery store. But when they're fresh picked, squash tastes like squash. It tastes really good, even just steamed. I know that now. Yeah, I add some butter, maybe a little salt, but the taste of the vegetables is good when they're fresh. Okay, so he eats his organic meal, and he said that all but one of the vegetables, all but that asparagus, bore the label of Cal Organic Farms, which with Earthbound dominates the organic produce section in the supermarket. Both companies were started by conventional growers looking for a more profitable niche and worried that the state might ban certain key pesticides. I'm not necessarily a fan of organic, a spokesman for Grimway recently told an interviewer. Right now, I don't see that conventional farming does harm. Whether we stay with organic for the long haul depends on profitability. Philosophy, in other words, has nothing to do with it. Okay, he's getting toward the end of Big Organic. And he's starting to sum it up by saying, yet growing the food is the least of it. Only a fifth of the total energy used to feed us is consumed on the farm. The rest is spent processing the food and moving it around. Okay, 80% of the energy used to feed us from these farms is used to process, store, and truck it. So is an industrial organic food chain finally a contradiction in terms? It's hard to escape the conclusion that it is. It can't last. Maybe that's why Bill Gates wants people to stop eating meat and start eating soybeans. Okay, that sums up part one, the ugly. I hope you took a break during it. It was a little long, but I got the information across that I wanted to. I hope that you'll start sourcing. On your own, that you'll know where your food comes from and that you'll know what's in it. I'm going to give a talk on ingredients at a later time, and how I look up ingredients, what websites I go to. But for now, just I hope you're intrigued a little to source your food, because if you do, you can overcome disease and live a much healthier. You'll have more energy. Things will be brighter. Days will just be brighter with good food, and you won't be poisoned. You won't get cancer. You won't get heart disease anywhere near as likely if you source your food and don't put anything bad inside your body. So keep eating the way you're eating. If you're eating from conventional places like Whole Foods, from the industry, don't starve yourself to death. Although I knew from Boy Scouts that it takes at least 3 weeks to starve to death, so I wasn't too worried when I decided one day to stop eating that stuff. And it took me a couple days to find good food, and I was really hungry at that point. I didn't starve to death. But there's no need for you to starve yourself. Just keep eating what you're eating. It takes a long time for that stuff to really harm anybody. And the next talk I'll give will be on the good. We did the ugly, the fast food. We did the bad, the organic industry, the Whole Foods industry, how it's unsustainable. And in the long run, not much different from what you're getting at McDonald's food. And then next we'll talk more about, well, where can we get food that is good for us? And there are two ways. That being said, let me show you my last slide. Okay, this is what I ate for, I gotta show it. Okay, this is what I ate for dinner for Christmas. And that's that piece of meat with the bone sticking out in the beginning after I roasted it. I'll play it one more time. If there's sound, you can hear it sizzle. But it came out great, and it tasted great, and it didn't come from Whole Foods, and it didn't come from McDonald's, and it wasn't that hard to get. So that's the teaser for next time. Let's go over here. That's the teaser for the next talk. Come find out how to eat nutritious, nutrient-dense food. Come back for the next talk, and I'll see you next time. And thanks for being patient and listening. And we'll do it again. Bye.